and bark beetle. There you go. I'm gonna dim the lights so we can see a little bit better and go ahead and it's all yours, Russ.
Perfect. Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Ryan and Alex, for inviting me today. I just wanted to share a little bit of information on wildfire mitigation and bark beetles. Ryan kind of invited me to share a bit, just to address some concerns, but also some potential misinformation that might be out there, and also just to give a little bit of background on Colorado is really our second largest disturbance and one of the main kind of risks to our forests and to lots of the properties around the state. So I'm also I'm a forester with the Colorado State Forest Service. Grew up in Colorado, but I've been down here in Durango now for just under 2 years. So I know lots of you have a lot more experience than I do in your roles. But yeah, I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about beetles. So somewhere out there in social media or in travel magazines, there's this idyllic Colorado cabin where there's nothing to worry about. They're just beautiful blue skies and no real threats. But unfortunately, that's not here. This is a wildfire adapted meeting. So you all are aware of the threats of wildfire down here in our forests in Colorado. And there's also the pressing threat of bark beetles in our forests. And I wanted to bring, before I get too far ahead of myself, I wanted to tie these two issues together, where some of the main drivers of fire behavior and increased fire risks are also some of the main drivers of our issues with beetles around the state. So especially relating to climate and to really dense forests. And lots of those forest density concerns are addressed in wildfire mitigation and the good work that you all are doing in your communities. And lots of those same issues or lots of those same methods can, for one, they can help reduce the risk of bark beetles really attacking the stand, but also some of the behaviors or some of the mitigation efforts can increase the risks of beetles temporarily. And so I wanted to kind of share some of that with you all today. So I'll start off with a little bit of a Beetles 101. There. Talk about some of the different beetle species that impact our forests, some of the preferred hosts, and some of the dynamics of a beetle outbreak. I'll also talk a little bit about management of bark beetles. And then I'll talk about prevention and some of the best practices for mitigation to consider bark beetles and forest health when you're doing fire mitigation work. And then if we have time, I'll touch a little bit on the kind of complex relationship between beetle outbreaks and fire. So to start off, I know most of you were able to share the neighborhoods that you work in and live in. And so I'll start off with the Ponderosa Pine Forest, since that's where most of y'all are from, it seems. Each beetle that I'll talk about has a preferred host. And so some of the beetles that really hit Ponderosa pines hard include the mountain pine beetle, which is a beetle that's really famous for its impacts, especially in the Front Range and beyond, all the way up into British Columbia. Some of those massive outbreaks that have left, 80% of a forest, dead. Those do exist down here in Southwest Colorado. We do have mountain pine beetles, and they really will attack all of our pines in the state, our true pines. So our lodgepole pines are kind of the target from the past 20 years of mountain pine beetle outbreaks in the Front Range, but they can also hit Ponderosa pines. Another species is the Western pine beetle, and we see quite a few of those in our area. I get called out as kind of our forest entomologist for the Colorado State Forest Service in our corner of the state. And when I peel back the bark on some of the diseased ponderosa pines, I see the galleries that clearly point to western pine beetles. And they really like those larger, kind of the largest ponderosa pines that grow in our forests. We also have the round-headed pine beetle, which has currently has a fairly large outbreak out in Montezuma County, up on the Glade. I don't know if anybody's been out there and seen just the kind of the scope of that outbreak, but it's a beetle that their range extends all the way down into Guatemala. We're kind of the northern cusp of the round-headed pine beetle range, and that range with a changing climate is expanding. So we're kind of on that edge of that round-headed pine beetle range. They also have a really late flight time, really most active from August until May. And I also wanted to touch on Ips in ponderosa pine. Ips is it's a whole genus of beetles. There are lots of different Ips. There are a handful that will attack ponderosa pine. But one of the most important things about Ips is that they're very attracted to slash. So the fresh slash that might be generated during mitigation efforts, that's kind of a magnet for Ips beetles, and probably our number one consideration when we're talking about wildfire mitigation and the threat of bark beetles. They typically have smaller outbreaks, but they can really expand quickly due to multiple generations per year. Up to 4 generations of Ips beetles will kind of hit across a summer. So they can pretty rapidly expand and hit some of our healthier trees. Now, at lower elevations, kind of continuing talking about Ips, there's one specific species of Ips that really hits those pinions. It's kind of a cyclical process, but if you are out in the areas south of us and in some of our PJ forests, you'll see a lot of dead pinion pines, and that's primarily the result of a significant pinion Ips outbreak. And those, just like their cousins that attack the ponderosa pines, they have a very long flight season, and there are multiple generations of Ips per year. And also, before I forget about it, I do have, I brought some of my beetles with me today in my backpack. So if anybody wants to see those after this presentation, I have some tips later on in the presentation that say, like, do not transport beetles. But today made an exception, so I've got some in the glass vials. But they're all about the size of a grain of rice, so they're really small beetles. But if you're in the pinion pine forests, or if you're in the lower elevation neighborhoods, pinion Ips are very responsive to fresh slash and generating fresh slash. So something to keep in mind. And then there are also there are different beetles that will attack our Douglas fir, our true firs, like our white fir and subalpine fir, and then our spruce. So I'm not going to come back to these quite as much throughout the presentation, but because they are pretty major beetles that impact our forests, I wanted to at least mention them up at the front. So there's the Douglas fir beetle, which is really, it's an issue all across the state, but in some of those mixed conifer forests, north-facing slopes, along the 240 corridor, you'll see some Douglas firs that are turning brown and dying, and those might be hit by Douglas fir beetles. There are also fir engravers that attack especially our white fir. Those, just like our Douglas fir beetles, just like our pine beetles, have 1 generation per year. And then there are also the spruce beetles. We get a lot of questions still, people driving up over Wolf Creek Pass and wondering if their ponderosas are safe because of all the dead trees that are up at the top of Wolf Creek Pass. All the trees that are really, all the dead spruce, those are all hit by spruce beetle, really a major outbreak, which is now kind of winding down. But those spruce beetles can really only attack spruce trees. They're not hitting the ponderosa pines. They're not a threat to our lower elevation forests. And those beetles actually sometimes take up to 3 years to complete one life cycle. Unlike all of our other beetles that will wrap up a life cycle in 1 year or less. All right. So to kind of document some of the stages of an outbreak or the stages of the life cycle really of our beetles. And once I guess I'm going to hop back and forth between the specific, you know, a species like the mountain pine beetle or the spruce beetle, like I was just talking about, and the general, where I'll be referring to pine beetles or bark beetles. And when I'm talking about those, I'm generally talking about our mountain pine beetle, our western pine beetle, our round-headed pine beetle, those beetles that are attacking the ponderosa forest primarily. So they all kind of have the same, even though they'll have different preferred hosts, they all have the same life cycle, more or less, where a female that's emerged from a tree that was infested will find a host tree. She'll fly around looking for visual cues and certain compounds that are put off by stressed or dying trees. And once she finds a tree, and also just she'll stumble across a tree by luck usually. If it's a good tree to attack, she will put out these pheromones that'll attract a lot of other beetles. And now, just like I said earlier, each beetle is about the size of a grain of rice. And that tiny beetle individually can't really bring down a whole tree. All of our trees, these are native beetles. And our trees have different defenses that they've built up to kind of resist these beetles. But if she finds a stressed tree or a tree that's not going to be able to fight off a beetle's attack, she'll kind of call in thousands of other beetles. And so to really have a successful attack on a tree, beetles need a lot of numbers. And so she'll attract these other beetles with different attracting pheromones. And those beetles will all meet at this tree. They'll breed and then they'll lay their eggs underneath the bark in these galleries. Once those eggs are laid, which happens sometime in the summer for most of our beetles, the eggs will hatch later in the summer, generally speaking, and then the larva will feed on the phloem of the tree. And so they're really cutting those tissues that are the living tissues of a tree, the straws that are bringing up nutrients and allowing the tree to survive. So they're girdling the tree, kind of cutting off all those tissues as those larvae are feeding on the tree. And that's really what kills the tree. And that kind of happens throughout the winter and into the spring. And the whole time that they're feeding, really, you might look at a tree and it's really difficult to know if you're driving by. While that tree is dying, it's still a green tree. It's not something that you're going to be able to catch on right away, generally speaking. So once they've kind of fed on the tree, and it's the spring and early summer of the next year, once the larvae have grown enough, they'll pupate inside of the tree, kind of fulfilling that like full metamorphosis, and then emerge from the tree as adults. And once they've emerged from the tree as adults, that's when you start to see that kind of that second summer. That's when you start seeing those needles turn red or turn brown, and by the time that you really can obviously tell that tree has been attacked, and by the time that you're ready to get your chainsaw out to drop that tree and reduce the threat of beetles, all the beetles have already left. So for the most part, the risk has really gone at that point, at least from a beetle mitigation standpoint. Maybe not from a wildfire risk mitigation, but by the time the needles are red, most of the larvae, if not all of them, will be gone. And so that whole process, for pine beetles, that takes about a year. For Ips, that's an 8-week process. And then for spruce beetles, that's a 2-year process. So especially since they're growing at a higher elevation, just takes a lot longer for them to grow. And so those outbreaks can really happen. They typically don't happen out of nowhere. One of the main causes of those outbreaks is really these like widespread stress events. So long-term droughts can really prime a forest for beetle outbreaks. So can wildfire. So when a wildfire kind of sweeps through an area, it kills some trees. Obviously, in this picture, all the black trees, those were all killed by canopy fire. And lots of the red trees in here, they might have been heat scorched, or they might have had some damage that stressed at least some of the trees. And then those beetles can really pick up on that stress, and then they'll come in and kind of finish the job. They can also, once they've kind of attacked the stress trees, then they move on to the stress trees neighbors. And once they have populations large enough, they can kill healthy trees as well. For some of our other beetles, especially our spruce beetles, those kind of like inciting events that kind of lead to these explosions can be blowdown or avalanches. So big windstorms can really knock down trees, and those trees, as they kind of break down, kind of become a magnet for beetles. And then some of the other events that can really trigger a growth in beetle populations include the creation of slash. So if you were to mitigate a large portion of forest, or have any kind of thinning where you don't really have a plan for slash and you build a lot of slash up, that can draw in beetles, which then can spill over into nearby healthy trees. And then once again, like I mentioned, just widespread drought, prolonged drought. After that's happened, the trees are just, they're struggling to grow as is. They don't really have enough resin to really fight off these beetles. And that's what leads to a landscape of susceptible trees. And so once again, those beetles are really looking around. They're flying around looking for visual cues of stress trees or blowdown or dead trees. And then they're also smelling, they're kind of guide. Some of our beetles are attracted to compounds put out by the tree, like alpha pinene, which is that really nice piney smell. The beetles like it too, not just little car air fresheners. So, all right, and here's kind of an example of one of those beetles. This is the western pine beetle. Sorry, it's blocked a little bit right now on the screen, but it shows two beetles. Once again, they're a lot smaller than they are on the screen, but they will kind of attack a tree as an adult. They lay their eggs in the bark in these galleries. The western pine beetle, their galleries look a little bit like spaghetti. They're really squirrely galleries that meander around. But those eggs will hatch into larvae, and the larvae will go through a number of generations before emerging again the following year as adults to find other trees. This graphics may be a little bit crowded, but it does show some of those pheromones that are released by the beetles. I mentioned earlier that there are pheromones that attract the beetles for the purpose of later on in this presentation. There are also pheromones that the beetles, once there are lots of beetles in one tree, they start emitting these other pheromones that repel other beetles. They say this tree is full, find a new home. And those are actually, it's the same, I don't know. I don't mean to get too far in the weeds, but they're microbes in the beetle's guts that will actually start changing those, initial pheromone, the attractant pheromone, into an anti-aggregate pheromone. So it's all a pretty cool system that they have in place, and one that we've also been able to mimic a little bit to protect certain trees. It's a little bit covered on the right side of this graphic, but there are also a number of other beetles in our forests that are beneficial and that can actually go into those trees and they hunt the pine beetles that are our pests. So there are lots of these natural systems that kind of keep those populations in check, at least at low levels. So if there's an outbreak of beetles on kind of in a forest, The first thing that you can really do to manage that outbreak is to recognize that there is an outbreak. One of the easiest ways to do that, before those needles start really turning red, is that you can identify some of the pitch tubes that are coming off of the tree. So if you look at the bole of the tree, you'll see these big pitch tubes that are coming out. It looks like somebody just stuck a piece of bubble gum to the bark of the tree. And that's where the tree is fighting that invasion of the beetles. It's a little bit difficult to see right here, but you can see some pitch tubes that are white, like this one, and you can see others that are kind of a reddish color. And generally speaking, when you see those white pitch tubes, that means that the tree was able to fight off that beetle right there. Once they kind of start getting that reddish coloration, that's when the tree wasn't so lucky. So that's where the beetle has started excavating some of that material out from underneath the bark in that phloem, and that's a successful hit. So if you start seeing a lot of pitch tubes, that's kind of a clue that there are likely beetles in there. Now, sometimes trees, especially if they're injured anywhere, they can kind of secrete a lot of that resin too. That doesn't necessarily mean that there are beetles, especially if it's pouring out somewhere. But if there are lots of these little tubes that are coming out of the bark, that's pretty much a sure sign that there are beetles in there. Now, if you were to look at those pitch tubes and you're really curious about what kind of beetle is in there, you can take a hatchet really and kind of cut away a little window of the bark. And if you do that above the pitch tube, you'll be able to see these galleries more often than not. And those galleries are really our clearest indicator of what kind of beetle is working here. Beetle or beetles, I guess I didn't mention in the last slide, but one of the other things that can draw in beetles is other beetles. So if there's one species that's hitting a tree, often there will be a lot of other species that are working alongside that beetle. And so you have these beetle complexes, they're called, where you might have 2 or 3 species of beetle that are hitting a tree at a time. But you can tell what beetles are in the tree by looking at those galleries. And also that'll help confirm that there are, in fact, beetles in the tree. And then there are some beetles that don't leave very much of a pitch tube. Also, if it's a really dry year, you might not even see any pitch tubes at all. If that tree just doesn't have any defense to really protect itself from the beetles, sometimes you won't see those pitch tubes. You might see some entry holes, and you might see some frass, kind of a sawdust that builds up between the bark of the tree. Or if you look at the bottom of trees, often there might be a little bit on the ground, or you'll notice that frass gets hung up in cobwebs sometimes, especially if you're looking at Douglas fir bark beetles. Those really don't create pitch tubes. It's almost all just that frass, that sawdust in the bark. And in addition to this, it's a little bit difficult to show a clear picture, but you'll also, before that tree really turns red, before those needles really start dying off, you can notice individual trees, little limbs, things like that are starting to kind of flag that there might be beetles in this tree. And that those trees we might call like faders, where you can see that in the canopy. But that can be a really difficult thing to identify, especially in the fall when the trees are already, they're dropping some of their needles. We get a lot of calls where people are wondering, all of the trees in my property, they're all dying, when in fact it might just be annual needle drop. So that can be a little bit difficult to be an identifying factor. But some of those pitch tubes, frass, exit holes, and galleries, those are all like really clear, signs that there might be a problem here. So once you've recognized some kind of a problem, some kind of a beetle outbreak, kind of the first thing that you can really do is sanitize some of those infested trees. Some of those trees before they're all starting to turn red, but after they have those pitch tubes, or after you might suspect that there are beetles in that tree. So if you get to those trees in time, when there are larvae inside of the tree, then you can really sanitize those trees. So if you cut the tree, and then dispose of it, you're really killing, potentially hundreds of thousands of beetle, larvae before they all emerge and infest your neighboring trees. So there are a few different ways that you can sanitize those. One of the most surefire ways to do that is to burn ponderosas. Unfortunately, if you cut a ponderosa and it was live this year, and there are beetles in there, it's probably going to be pretty difficult to burn. Just that wet wood can be a challenge. And also you would have to get burn permits for that, potentially. You can also chip smaller trees. Beetles will infest trees, down to about 6 inches, 8 inches. That's about the smallest size that they'll really attack. But you can chip up some of the limbs that might harbor, especially the Ips beetles. You can debark the bole of the tree. So if you peel back the bark, that will destroy all the habitat for those beetles. Or you can also cook them really with solar treatments. This first picture here shows one example of people doing that. It can be a little bit challenging. You have to have the right conditions. You have to have the right site. But essentially, you're wrapping logs with clear tarps. And if it's in a sunny kind of south-facing site, you can really kind of steam out those beetles. So that can kill off all the larvae that are underneath that bark. If you're rotating those logs, if you have a good enough seal, but it can be a challenging process. One way that a lot of landowners will deal with that, in a more budget-friendly way, is to try and dry out as much of that wood as you can. So if you cut those infected trees into, as thin of slices as you can, and then let those just dry out in the sun, rotating those and kind of break up that bark as much as you can, that can dry out the bark enough to kill the beetles before they emerge. And one thing I will note is that if I see anybody in here advertising free beetle infested wood on Facebook Marketplace, not invited back. No, I don't have the authority to say that. But don't transport any beetle infested wood. Don't sell it as firewood if you can. Don't give it away. And really don't store that material, that infested wood near live trees, especially. So that's where those beetles can really jump over into other receptive hosts. And now there are a couple of other things. One additional treatment is to really hang some of those pheromones from trees. There are different packets that people can purchase. Those pheromones are really, really effective for Douglas fir beetles. That's the pheromone that Douglas fir beetles are repelled by is MCH, and the pheromone that lots of the pine beetles are repelled by, that's verbenone, and that can be applied on the trees in like this kind of like a caulking or in these little packets. And I want to point out that that's not really an alternative to treatments. If you're hanging packets in a really dense forest, that only goes so far, and pheromone treatments do nothing really to change the number of beetles that are out there in the forest. So it's not a real long-term solution. But if there is an outbreak and you have specific really high-value trees near your property, and you're able to confirm that the beetle that is attacking your trees is one that responds to pheromones like verbenone or MCH, it can be a solution or an additional treatment to really protect those high-value trees near home or some of the older trees potentially on the property, something that has a lot of value to you. And one thing that really we don't recommend at the Colorado State Forest Service is the application of insecticides on trees that have already been infested, especially. So I get calls about people wondering, if they should spray carbaryl on their red trees, or if they should douse their, trees that they just cut down, if they should douse everything in diesel fuel. And that's not something that we recommend, especially just, touching back on some of those beneficial insects. There are different, insects that really, provide a key role, in our forest ecosystem. And by kind of widespread application of some of these insecticides, that can disrupt lots of the food webs, that we have working with us, to help control our beetle populations. Also, application of, most insecticides on trees that have already been infested by beetles, there's really very little, evidence to suggest that that reduces the likelihood of outbreaks. And that's not an approved use of those pesticides, especially, carbaryl, permethrin, in the state of Colorado. There can be some, there's some benefit from treating healthy trees near outbreaks with insecticides. But generally speaking, we're now moving, towards more of a pheromone-based, prevention strategy rather than a widespread insecticide prevention strategy, at least in areas where those outbreaks are a lot smaller. And once again, I feel like, I have to include this because anytime I talk about bugs, it's always a bad thing. And we really aren't talking about, bugs from an appreciative, standpoint, usually in this field of forestry. So I wanted to point out, these insects are essential for cycling lots of our nutrients, for breaking down lots of that wood once it's down on the forest floor, for retaining lots of that moisture in lots of our fuels, and for providing a base for that food web, and for pollinating lots of our native plants. And they're also, going back to that food web principle, our pine beetles, they are attacked by other beetles, which can help keep them in check. Our friendly clarid beetles, I've got one with me today. They're also parasitic wasps, which can help naturally regulate populations of mountain pine beetle and our other pine beetles that actually will lay their eggs in the larvae of those beetles. And those it's really pretty gruesome, but those wasps will really eat those the larvae out from the inside out, and can reduce those populations through that. And then there are also woodpeckers, which can help regulate outbreaks, especially when they're smaller, little isolated clusters. And they do make a difference. So kind of going from a management of outbreaks to more of a lens of preventing beetle outbreaks in the first place. Those outbreaks are dependent on disturbance, like I mentioned earlier. Some of those, like fires, can really kick off an outbreak, but also just generally forests that have poor resilience to drought, things like that. Forests that are even aged, especially around here, lots of our forests were all logged about 100 years ago. 100 to 120 years ago. And all the trees now are, they're all on the menu for lots of our beetles, rather than having kind of a mixed age forest where there are some trees that are more appealing than others. And so that just leaves us with a more vulnerable forest. Climate is another driver of outbreaks. So as we get warmer and potentially drier futures, that can stress those trees. But the main, and I don't mean to say that we can't impact our forest composition or our climate. Those are two other things that are beyond the scope of this presentation. But one thing that we can really kind of make a change to is the density of trees in our forests. And I wanted to also point out that that's a great overlap with fire mitigation. So around, the WUI kind of reducing the density of our trees and kind of reducing that density of the canopy, not only helps reduce extreme fire behavior, but can also mitigate our beetle threats. So here I have a picture of two ponderosa stands near us. The first one shows kind of this forest that is at high risk of bark beetles. It's a really dense forest. There's a lot of stressed trees in there, especially if a drought comes through. And some of the conditions in that forest really are beneficial to those pheromones as well. So when forests are really dense, there's less air movement, and there's higher humidity, and those beetles can really thrive in that microclimate where if they start putting out their pheromones that tell all their friends to come and attack this tree, that message comes across loud and clear to all the other beetles in the forest. So on the right, we have a different stand, a much more open stand down along the Piedra. And those trees are just growing at a much lower density. That means that not only are they typically healthier trees that are going to be more resilient to attacks, but also that kind of like microclimate. It's going to be dry, it's going to be breezy, it's going to be sunny, and when the beetles are looking for trees, those aren't the conditions that they like. So that can be a lot more resistant to beetles and less likely to be attacked, while also having a lower likelihood of canopy fire. All right, so I want to go over to some of the best practices for mitigation. And the first one is to be mindful of the seasons that beetles are out and about. And now turning back to mitigation, once again, kind of the main beetle that we're talking about right here is our Ips beetle, also called the pine engraver beetle. And this little graph right here, this chart shows that let's see, the larvae and the pupae, they are the red and the green bars. That's when those adults are laying those eggs, and those life cycles are kind of continuing, and those populations can really increase during those red and green bars. Unfortunately, those are kind of maybe the best times to be working out in the woods around here. But if you don't, mind working up a sweat and getting warm yourself, November to March is really the best time for wildfire mitigation if you don't want to worry about beetles. You're really creating slash, you're creating wounds on trees potentially at a time when nobody's around to be smelling those out. So if you're avoiding those flight times, that's kind of the best possible time to be working on mitigation without worrying too much about beetles. Sometimes this shows maybe a little bit of a compressed timeline. We see Ips starting to fly around here, starting in April. But really anytime that the daytime highs are consistently above about 50 degrees. And so if you aren't able to work kind of in that same time from November to March, just have a plan for your slash that you're going to be generating in mitigation activities before you start, running that saw. So if you're generating a lot of slash, it's a good idea to use the Wildfire Adapted Partnerships slash or chipper rebate program, something like that. Or just have a plan for chipping some of that slash up. Once it's chipped down to little, 2-inch, 4-inch chips, whatever. That's too small then to harbor those Ips larvae. So breaking that up, it also dries things out. You won't want to be putting those chips underneath any trees. So if you can avoid piling those chips underneath, especially pinions, we do see a lot of that where people will chip a lot. And then they've got this nice mulch that's ready to use. They'll pile it up underneath a pinion or something like that. And that tree might die because suddenly all those you know, that alpha pinene going back is kind of a magnet to those beetles that might hone in on this otherwise healthy tree. You can also remove that cut material from the forest at least. So even just dragging it out to openings can be better than having it underneath the forest or piled up underneath healthy trees. And if you're just generating small amounts of slash, it's okay to scatter that out throughout the forest. So kind of that lop and scatter method can kind of distribute the slash enough to really not be a magnet to any one particular tree. So a third thing, you know, best practice for mitigation is once you've already been doing some mitigation, keep an eye out for any beetle activity, any increases on the property. So those Ips beetles are really the first ones that you'll be looking out for. And you can see portions of trees. One of the signatures of an Ips outbreak is that the tree might die from the top down. Here is a ponderosa pine where the top is really dying. It might also just die at certain branches. Those Ips beetles, they like the smaller diameters farther up the trunk or even on large branches. And so they'll start cutting off individual parts that might spread to the rest of the tree, or sometimes the tree is able to take care of it from there. But just keep an eye out for that. And not as much of an issue with Ips, but if you suspect that you might have other pine beetles, you can consider treating some of your higher value trees with semiochemicals, that verbenone, as I was mentioning earlier. And so a few things not to do: don't pile slash near trees. Once again, just drawing them in like a magnet. Or pile fresh, you know, chips underneath vulnerable trees. Not a great idea. One thing that we don't recommend that I've gotten a couple questions about is really using like a pruning paint or sealant on those fresh cuts. That might reduce the likelihood of beetles coming in, but by painting those wounds over, you can also trap a lot of moisture and potentially introduce some fungus into the tree that is a whole nother health threat. One thing that you really don't want to do is transport wood containing beetles. Nobody likes to really keep it in their backyard, but please don't, you know, spread it elsewhere as well. And, you know, kind of share that message of not, you know, moving wood very far from its origins, especially if it harbors beetles. And then also don't avoid mitigation altogether because there might be a threat of beetles. So especially in our ponderosa forests, I've shown a lot of a handful of pictures at least of red trees and death and disease, but lots of ponderosas are generally pretty resilient around mitigation. We're not going, if you cut one tree, you know, 7 trees aren't going to die because of that. Generally speaking, you know, especially if you follow the principles earlier of just handling your slash, it's pretty unlikely for your whole forest to die, really. That's not going to happen. All right, and let's see how we're doing on time. I might be going a little bit long.
You're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a kind of a complicated relationship between beetles and fire, where I think there's a fair amount of misinformation about beetle outbreaks causing large fires, especially following kind of this idea that, you know, recently in the past 20 years, we've seen a lot of large scale beetle outbreaks. And recently in the past 20 years or so, we've also seen much larger and more frequent fires throughout the West. And beetle kill doesn't actually really cause larger or more frequent fires. It's definitely complicated where there are immediate impacts right after, you know, trees are killed by beetles. Once they have those brown needles before they've dropped those needles, and once the tree has died, those fuels can really dry out much more quickly. And that can be a very receptive fuel, kind of a dead tree with lots of dead needles. But once those needles have dropped down to the floor, needles are really one of the main carriers of fire in like a crown fire in a big, if you see a photograph of a fire ripping through somewhere, really that's burning the needles primarily. And it's not, spreading from the bole of one tree that's dropped all of its needles from beetle kill to the next tree that's dropped all of its needles. It's a little bit more complicated than that. There are long-term impacts and following beetle kill, there can be lots of deadfall in a forest, which can be really challenging to fire suppression efforts. It can be really hard to fight those fires, especially if you were paying any attention to last year's fires out on the San Juan closer to Pagosa. Some of those fires, there's really not a whole lot that could be done because of the complexity of the fuels there. There can also be regeneration of oak very quickly after beetle kill, which at certain times of year can be a really dangerous and flashy fuel. So really, beetles and fire, it's a pretty complicated relationship, where we can't really say that because these trees are dead, our fire risk is definitely going up, or we're more likely to have a large fire. It's more complicated than that. And finally, if you want to take a look at some of the bugs that are in our forests, the Colorado State Forest Service conducts these aerial detection flights every year, and they publish the findings of those flights in an annual forest health report. If you look up just CSFS annual forest health report, that'll pull up, as well as a map showing the beetles that have really hit our forests in our area. So you can zoom into your neighborhood and see what was detected. So right here in this little screenshot of that map, you can see some spruce beetle kind of up above lemon and viaceto that's still kind of hitting some of the healthy spruce up there. You can see fir engravers hitting the white fir along 240, and then you can see these little speckles out here. That's the pinion nips that's hitting those for the most part. But you can explore kind of all across the state and see what beetles are in your neck of the woods. And with that, I think, oh, there we go. I can answer, or I can try to answer any questions at least, so.
For some of our homeowners that are working on getting rid of these trees, but they have property up against US Forest property, what do they do if they notice more dead and pine beetle kill just beyond their fence?
That's a good question. And I think the first thing that you could really do is reach out to the US Forest Service. Unfortunately, you can't take a chainsaw across, the other side of a fence and start doing things yourself. And sometimes things move slowly with different partners. But at least like seeing if there's a plan in place, seeing if there's anything that can be done by the forest, that's one place to start. And another place that you can go is really start looking into those pheromones that you can hang. So yeah, the pheromones, if you've done all the work that you really can on your side of the fence, that can kind of be a good backup. So some of those pouches, the smaller pouches, those run, I think, about $3.50. The larger pouches that you hang on trees, those are about $7 for verbenone. Verbenone is about 80% effective in ponderosa pines, at least against mountain pine beetle. There's not as much research on western pine beetle or round-headed pine beetle, just because they're not as widespread. But yeah, it can be a somewhat effective backup. And if you have a 2-acre parcel or a 5-acre parcel or something like that, especially, or even if you have a slightly larger parcel, that can be a solution where, it's fairly cost effective, and just for a little bit of peace of mind at least.
Okay, thank you.
Where do you get all?
You can- Yeah, you can buy those online directly from, if you look up like forestry suppliers, or if you just Google Verbenone, that'll pop up right away. And you can buy those in packs of 10, I believe. So, yeah, you can get those. You can also get those through the Colorado State Forest Service. We do, purchase, Verbenone and MCH for private landowners, and we can also hang that, for people.
How do we identify what beetle is attacking your tree? You just gotta identify the tree, the type of tree. So I have several trees that are probably that big around,
Mhm.
and they look like somebody took their DeWalt drill and drilled
Mm.
holes in it. And there's sap coming out of every one of those holes. Of course, these trees get watered,
Right.
and one of them's down from a downspout, but they get water. It looks like it's fighting it off. It's not brown,
Mm.
but you can tell something's attacking.
Right. Yeah, so, you can contact a professional forester or an arborist in the area, that they should be able to help you with that. If you can identify your species of tree, you can get a pretty good idea of what that might be. And if you have a lot of trees that are like that, or if you start seeing any trees that start,
We've had
failing.
at least 20 of them die.
Yeah, especially if you have dead ones, that's a great time to cut a little window into that bark. So if you cut just a little square, especially, at one of those pitch tubes and right above it, that'll, just by looking at the shape of that gallery, you can identify what beetle, was working there. And then from there, you can kind of,
So you damage a live tree if you do that?
so it does create a little bit of a wound, and it can damage a live tree. But if you have dead trees that recently died from that same issue, or if you have trees that are starting to turn brown, once those trees start fading, there's really no saving that tree. So that tree has already effectively died and is just hanging there on the stump. So if you start seeing anything that is dying, that's when you can kind of take a look at what's inside of there. And from there, you might decide to hang Verbenone, or especially if you start seeing that and it's still, hasn't turned brown yet, it might be a good idea to sanitize that tree. Especially if that pitch tube has more color in it. If it's just white, that tree's still hanging in there and putting up a good fight. But if it really starts showing a lot more color, like kind of that reddish, brownish on that pitch tube, that's a good indication that tree is starting to
Most
lose.
of them are all, I would say it's kind of yellowish.
Yeah, kind of a yellowish. If it's still kind of a pure yellow, that can be a good thing, but that's not a hard and fast rule where a tree that isn't showing that brown yet might still, keel over, but yeah, if you go back and try and look at what species that was through a dead tree, that can be a good start. Or if you reach out to a forester or arborist, they can, kind of consult you as you move forward. Mhm.
So to avoid large piles of slush, what would you say with generally large?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think. It all depends on how close you are to other trees, and how much slash you're generating. I don't know. I would say if you can well, it's also difficult because, burning is really one of the best ways to get rid of slash later on. And by creating little burn piles, you are creating somewhat of a magnet. But that's reasonably one of the most realistic ways to treat slash in the work. So it's kind of a trade-off. And I wouldn't say there's a real cutoff. It's just something more to consider if you are piling any slash, and kind of maybe considering more avoiding piling near other trees, which is also a good principle for, you know, burning slash piles, but, yeah, that's a good question that I don't have a great answer to. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, in your pictures of the forest that was susceptible to the beetle and then the one that wasn't,
Mhm,
I noticed the one that was susceptible had a lot of undergrowth,
mhm.
and the one that is not susceptible didn't have any undergrowth. It was nice and clear. Does that make a difference with the beetle infestation? If you've cleared out the undergrowth?
That's a good question. I really don't think it will make much of a difference. You know, those beetles, especially our pine beetles, they're landing a little bit higher up on the tree. So they're, you know, they're not going to be influenced very much by like the humidity that comes from having a lot of oak down low. But that's a good question. There in that photo, those are two different, just two different growing sites with
Yeah.
different histories, and one I think had probably had more fire on the ground, for a longer time, but, yeah, that's a good question. But I suspect the answer is that it really doesn't make much of a difference.
Wouldn't clearing out the oak help those trees that are remaining be more resilient to drought and stuff like that? So therefore kind of helping with the beetle problem?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay.
That makes a lot of sense. Just reducing some of the water competition. Yeah, it's also a little bit complicated in that
Sure.
oak soils, like underneath, you know, oak. Those are kind of our richest soils that retain some of the water the
Gotcha.
longest.
Okay.
And that oak can sometimes be less of a competitor than it seems. But yeah, I'd be interested in finding out more.
It's
I'll
complicated.
look into it. It's
Yeah, yeah.
complicated, yeah.
But for wildfire risk, it definitely was like, that's our before and after pictures. of
Yeah,
fire.
right.
Yeah,
Like, yeah. it's very
absolutely.
similar.
And yeah, and once again, kind of touching back, like there are lots of mutual benefits where if you're mitigating for wildfire, often you are kind of helping your forest avoid beetle issues in the future too. And so, yeah, I would guess that probably the oak presence is a net negative on, you know, on the health of the tree.
Sure.
But it's probably complicated. Yeah.
Nice.
So a question that you may or may not have the answer to. Do we, or does that study's been done as to how far these beetles can, a single beetle capability of travel distances, right?
Mhm.
Can it go 2 miles, 3 miles, 10 miles, 100 miles? Right?
Yeah.
Before it has to find another place
Mhm.
to lay its eggs.
Right. I know they can fly up to 2 miles. I don't know beyond that. But generally speaking, I mean, like, the closer you are to where those beetles are emerging, there's never just one beetle that's emerging. You know, you're gonna have thousands of beetles emerging from one tree, so really the farther away you get from that one tree, the less likely those beetles are to all find the same place. But yeah, they can disperse pretty widely. I'm sure if it's windy, that might help them too. But yeah, they can travel pretty far distances.
So the second question is in relation to the stress around the tree and prescribed fire.
Mhm,
Because we're talking about two different types of fire.
definitely.
Wildfire, which really stresses the tree,
Mhm,
versus a controlled prescribed fire, because what I would hate to see is people become afraid of well-managed prescribed fire in terms of going through a forest because of beetle. And that could be a very negative thing to take away.
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit difficult also to even answer that because I was reading one study from California in the Sierra this year where the prescribed fire in addition to thinning actually kind of had a neutral impact on susceptibility to beetles because you know, the restoring kind of a historic fire regime, it helped the forest in some ways, but because our forests aren't really adapted to that fire now, because of especially I think there's some discussion on the depth of the duff layers and kind of those fine roots of those larger trees growing up into that duff. Once those fires come through, they're more stressful now. Prescribed fire, broadcast burning, is more stressful to trees than it would have been if it was a regular occurrence.
Right.
And so, it can stress trees a little bit, which can, kind of negate some of its benefits. It's still not a bad thing. Prescribed fire, didn't negatively impact beetles, but it wasn't as positive as mechanical treatments in this one study. But yeah, I don't mean to say that fire is a bad thing in the forest and that fire is going to lead to, you know, the beetles overtaking everything. But I wish I could stop saying this, but it's complicated.
I totally did, and I knew that was complicated, but I just hear from people all over the state of Colorado that I don't want to create more stress, therefore I don't want a prescribed fire, therefore I have more mitigation, therefore I have more slash, therefore I have,
Right.
it's just this,
And then,
you know?
yeah, absolutely. And if you're choosing between two routes, you know, just, I think lots of the, you know, generating slash, in that study that I was reading, I don't know if they're really comparing those impacts or how they're treating that slash. So, yeah, prescribed fire is kind of one of our best tools, if not our best tool for restoring healthy forests in the state of Colorado.
Bryce, would it be accurate to think that, decades of suppression has contributed to density and that overlay with climate change, and all these other factors that create stress has contributed to what we're experiencing?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think kind of the state of our forests is one that's more and more susceptible to beetles. And lots of that is just because, once again, kind of going back to that density issue. You know, there's a threshold of density where forests of our ponderosa forests exceed that threshold. That there's kind of a tipping point where they just become a lot more susceptible to our pine beetles. And that's around 80, a basal area of about 80 square feet per acre, which is getting a little too far into jargon. But there's kind of once they cross over a certain density, yeah, which happens when you keep, you know, fires out of our forests. That's just a natural relationship.
Okay, so a couple kind of thoughts, questions for you, Bryce. So is it correct that I got out of that the only beetle that is attracted to slash is the Ips? That accurate?
I would say the Ips is the most attracted to slash by a lot. Yeah. I think there's still like not a ton of consensus over how beetles find their homes. You know, I think that there could be, you know, a slightly higher risk of beetles identifying trees as stressed once they have wounds or things like that from mitigation.
Yeah.
Other pine beetles like our, you know, our mountain pine beetle or our western pine beetle. But when we're mitigating, like the main concern really should be Ips.
Gotcha.
Probably.
I'm curious, just along that kind of conversation, the timing conversation. A lot of folks here probably would be most concerned with Ips being in ponderosa or pinyon.
Mhm.
And realistically, wildfire adapted, I'll just speak for us, 100% of our projects occur from March to November, right? I would actually probably assume that 80% plus of Colorado State Forest Services projects happen between that timeline in a similar forest type also, right?
Definitely.
So I'm curious if you can help kind of some of our landowners and homeowners here have ways that they can talk to their neighbors who might be concerned about Ips flying, so you shouldn't do mitigation now. Like, what are some, I mean, I think you kind of covered it already, right? About, well, it's more maybe about managing slash, but what are some other ways that folks can help their neighbors be more accepting or open to wildfire mitigation in that time when Ips is flying?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Kind of a major hardball.
Yeah. No, I think that's kind of a challenge. And, you know, when we're out talking to people, we want to say like that, you know, be mindful that maybe working, you know, if you're generating a lot of slash, there might be some trees, there might be a tree or two that can that might be infested by IPS. And there's no one way to kind of, there's no one way to completely eliminate that risk. But if you look at kind of the pictures of forests that are all dead from beetles. Well, I was going to say that's not because of fire mitigation. That's never really because of fire mitigation. It might be from, you know, drought. It might be from kind of these larger factors. But the actual risks from fire mitigation activities are relatively low. You're not going to lose your whole forest. Especially when we're talking about IPS and when we're talking about you know, beetles that are coming in because of fire mitigation. I think it's more of a risk if you're talking about pine beetles that are coming in regardless of your fire mitigation and then not doing anything about that. And I think if I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but yeah, I think I want to acknowledge that there's a risk to IPS and like activities working in the woods, you know, is gonna kind of have a slight risk to your surrounding trees, but that risk is relatively low, and it's a lot lower than maybe the risk of catastrophic fire to a house or something like that. So it's all in check, you know, it's all things that you have to balance.
Yeah, I think kind of what you're saying and agreeing with that, like, you know, is there a causal relationship where if you're doing wildfire mitigation, then you will have an IPS outbreak? No. Is there a causal relationship between if your, you know, property is just absolutely crowded with trees, will your house burn down?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
to me, that kind of makes me understand the values and reality of risk in a way that, yes, there is IPS risk, that is true, but which one is kind of the more present
Yeah.
risk, maybe? I don't know.
Def-
Sorry, that's kind
definitely.
of a blunt way of saying it.
No, that's a great way to put it. And you don't see 100 trees die from IPS. You don't, you know, really see 20 trees die from IPS in our ponderosa forest. You might see one kind of, you know, casualty if things aren't done to mitigate risk. And also kind of going back to what you were mentioning, like if you have a really dense stand anyways, and you're doing fire mitigation, what you're also doing is mitigating the risk for all the other beetles that are potentially more catastrophic. So while you are increasing, maybe marginally increasing the risk of IPS on your property, you're decreasing probably more drastically the likelihood of other bark beetles, of other pine beetles coming in. So
Yeah, I think maybe also perhaps the issue is like folks who have that reaction to beetles maybe don't have the right assessment of how likely a wildfire could be, right? And they're perceiving that's like pretty much zero.
definitely,
Right,
yeah,
so then the IPS is actually being 10% is an issue, right? When actually that percentage of wildfire or catastrophic level could be higher than they perceive. Anyway.
yeah,
Sounds like maybe the opportunity is the placement of the pile and, and how quickly you treat it,
Yeah.
remove it.
Manage the slash.
Manage it is an important message.
Yeah, that's the biggest takeaway. I like that. Don't be beetle phobia and that avoidance. It's like having that plan is part of the work, right? Not just cutting and stopping, but being able to take care of that slash. And that's part of the process. I think that's the biggest takeaway. Yeah.
You
yeah.
cover your slash pile with plastic as a whole? Will that work? You know, like a big,
Yeah, it would probably be somewhat effective, and in other states, they actually do, especially wet states, in Washington and Oregon, they cover lots of their slash piles also, just to reduce how wet that gets, you know, kind of reduce the retention of water in there and help dry that pile out faster. So, that's a good question. I would guess that there'd be some kind of
it looked like you're doing logs, which would be very time consuming,
uh-huh,
but if you did the whole pile.
yeah, kind of sealed some of that scent in. Yeah, that's a good point. I can't answer that with a whole lot of confidence, but it's not a bad idea.
You could fill it with wasp.
And woodpeckers. You can create a slash pile that you generate enough heat internally as it starts to break down that you can, what they call spontaneously combust, because you're generating too much heat inside.
Hmm.
So the smaller the pile, the less likely that is to happen versus if you start getting to that, this is the fire investigator in me talking, right? So when you get to the 6 to 8 foot size pile of that smaller slash, and it starts to break down in the center, it generates heat. As it generates heat, it can create enough to ignite. We've had that happen here in a couple. So if you're gonna do it, Dale, notify the fire department. No, I'm kidding.
Thanks for bringing that perspective. Yeah.
I would also speak to what Alex was saying, that I think maybe on perspective to homeowners that might be a little leery about doing any treatment for fear of having mosquitoes or whatever, is we're trying to improve the forest health. And so as long as you're trying to continually improve the forest health, you're gonna have less problems with insects in general that are negative, beetle insects. As long as you're continually improving the health so that the trees can fight off any attacks.
Yeah, that's good.
Any questions online?
Yeah, are there any questions online? Well,
Thanks, Bryce. It was very
Yeah.
helpful. This is great.
that was awesome.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, the sign-in sheet, did everybody get that? Or did it end up?
Sign-in sheet is back here.
Okay.
Anybody who didn't sign in, please.
Thanks,
sign in.
man.
We'll try
That was
to-
great.
And shirts, stickers, bags, and if they're out of the size you need for a shirt, just let us know and we'll make sure to get you one. We have some other sizes and more of those at the office.